My name is Aaliyah Ned, and I am the Director of Government Relations at the National Cooperative Business Association. So I'm excited to be with all of you here today to talk about co-op policy priorities. In my role at the National Cooperative Business Association, I lead our state, federal, and local advocacy work. What that means is really engaging with policymakers and legislation and regulations at all level of governments to ensure that folks are, number one, educated about the cooperative business model across all sectors, as well as ensuring that cooperatives are included as a key strategy for policymakers to achieve goals. As we well know, the cooperative difference cannot be overstated, but I will jump into that a little bit later and would love to just share a little bit about NCBA CLUSA. So we have been around as an organization for about over 100 years, celebrating our 100-year anniversary a few years ago. And we are the oldest and largest trade association for cooperatives across all sectors. So this includes our agriculture and farmer co-ops, our retail co-ops, utilities such as rural electrics, worker cooperatives, purchasing, housing, and financing side. And just a few examples of what that might look like in practical day-to-day. We know that co-ops touch every part of our economy and benefit not only the member owners of the cooperatives by empowering individuals and providing them with economic power to drive a more equitable economy, but also filling the gaps where policy interventions have not sufficiently addressed that. Credit unions represent a large swath of worldwide financing transactions with 339 million members, globally. Limited equity co-ops or housing cooperatives provide affordable housing to individuals across the country. Food cooperatives not only provide healthy food options, but also empower local producers by sourcing more numbers of local produce locally. Farmers, the majority of the 2 million farmers across our country belong to at least one of our nation's 1,800 agricultural co-ops, and rural electric co-ops serve 92% of persistent poverty county. Their critical role in electrifying rural America was recognized and empowered by the federal government and are on the cutting edge of addressing the climate crisis and ensuring broadband access is equitable across the country. There are currently, we estimate to be 65,000 cooperative establishments with 130 million members across the United States. We say approximately because we don't quite have that number, but through the advocacy work of folks like yourselves and NCBA CLUSA and its members, we were able to get a new question to identify the cooperative landscape within the economic census that goes out by the Census Bureau dating back to 2017, and hope to have those final numbers soon. And we know 1 in 3 Americans are a member of a co-op, whether they realize it or not. Shopping at local cooperatives, getting produce from cooperatives, or banking with credit unions. They are members of co-ops. And we know that people turn to the cooperative model for 3 primary reasons: to address market failures and fill in those gaps, to help small players such as farmers, utilities, food co-ops, worker-owned businesses to gain parity with larger investor-owned competitors while returning those profits back to the member owners through patronage, and giving consumers across the board a very deliberate choice of enterprise to better meet common needs and aspiration that is rooted in our cooperative values and the 7 cooperative principles. And we know those values and those principles make a difference. Compared to other models, we know that cooperatives reinvest back into local economies at a higher rate. As you can see here, for example, food co-ops reinvest 1.6% of every $1,000 that is spent into the local economies. We know they create and maintain more high quality local jobs with our farmer co-ops, providing 250,000 jobs and paying 11 billion in wages to rural Americans. They source more goods locally, are more responsive to community needs through the nimbleness of our democratic governance process, and empower member owners to be more civically engaged. As we've seen, members of housing cooperatives are more likely to engage as citizens within their local policy making traditions. And overall, throughout the pandemic, we saw particularly, but going back to the start of the cooperative movement in the US, that they have greater business survival rates, as worker-owned co-ops are 2/3 more likely to succeed than the average or more traditional business model. So diving into what our policy priorities are, how we can ensure that this cooperative difference is recognized across the board and continue to support cooperative development. We have these long-standing priorities that tend to shift over time slightly, depending on where federal policy priorities are, whether local needs need to be addressed through legislative solutions. But overall, these have been longstanding and give us a good indication in what we can expect in the remainder of 2023, remaining resilient despite any political headwinds, as well as moving forward. So recognizing this cooperative difference, we know that the fair tax treatment of cooperatives through subchapter T and other state statutes is incredibly important, because that value add does get reinvested back into local economies. Looking at this year, the Farm Bill, which is the major piece of reauthorization governing farm and rural economic development policy, comes up every 5 years. How can maybe these programs be leveraged to support co-ops and capacity building? International cooperative development and international food assistance programs are critically vital to sustaining a global cooperative movement. As an organization, NCBA CLUSA has been an implementer of international cooperative development programs for the last 70 years. So how can this work continue to be supported? And small businesses are the backbones of local economies. So how can we increase that access to capital to make sure these community institutions are preserved despite challenges that may be upcoming, such as a large number of business owners who are set to retire? How can we also address the current affordable housing crisis? And we know that co-ops are a proven strategy to do so. And then overall, creating a more resilient nation, responding to climate change and mitigating climate change through the cooperative model, and implementing new legislation. So as I mentioned, the tax status of cooperatives has been a longstanding priority for NCBA CLUSA and the cooperative community writ large. The current federal tax policy recognizes that value add that co-ops capture for their member owners. Unlike traditional business models, which are oftentimes extractive, cooperatives put more dollars in the pockets of working families across the board and help small businesses and families compete by preserving subchapter T and other state statutes that recognize this. So how can we ensure that cooperatives are treated fairly and not put at a disadvantage relative to other forms of business? Education is really key, and we recognize that as a community in the spirit of education and training and Principle 5. And that's often the first step when engaging with policymakers. Big ticket items, we know that Congress has a lot of work to do passing the federal budget that comes up every year, and that will be top of mind, particularly in this October-November timeframe. But also there is the Farm Bill this year. As I mentioned, it is a major piece of legislation that governs USDA's programs across the board. And it comes up every 5 years. This happens to be one of them. So how can we make sure that our farming communities, our producers, folks who rely on nutrition assistance program, as well as rural economic development, is supported in a meaningful way? Part of this is the Rural Cooperative Development Grant Program. This is currently the only federal program that supports cooperative development in the US, and it is authorized through the Farm Bill. Through this program, cooperative development centers provide technical assistance and cooperative education to communities and support the co-op ecosystem. So how are there opportunities for this program to be modernized, to be better implemented across the board, and to allow these co-op development centers maximize that multiplier effect that we know is rooted in the cooperative model? Affordable energy infrastructure is critically important for folks across the board, particularly within our rural communities. And the Rural Energy Savings Program is a great one that is leveraged by many rural electric co-ops to allow their member owners to get new water heaters or new HVAC systems, things that would be otherwise unaffordable to pay for immediately out of pocket. And so rural electric co-ops are bridging that gap and filling in to make sure that as we experience, hotter summers and colder winters as a result of climate change, that these energy infrastructure upgrades continue to be affordable. Investment in capacity building for rural communities and locally led economic development. Something that is rooted within co-ops is starting from the member owners to govern the cooperative overall. And economic development should be the same way, but I'll touch on that a little bit later. And bridging the digital divide. We saw over the last few years, particularly just how important access to a reliable internet connection is. And over 200 rural electric co-ops to date are already deploying or have plans to deploy internet in other areas where, again, there's a market failure and traditional utilities may not be incentivized to invest. So what are the programs that we can use to support that? And as I mentioned, international food aid programs across the board. As we know, global food security is part of our national security, so supporting the cooperative model through that. Starting with rural economic development through the Farm Bill. Again, you hear the Farm Bill, and we know that the Farm Bill and rural communities are intrinsically linked. So supporting economic development and rural economic development through the reauthorization process is top of mind for us. As I mentioned, the Rural Cooperative Development Grant Program supports cooperative development organizations to provide technical assistance to co-ops in local communities. But we know there are some gaps across the board as centers who have received funding through this program for the last 10, 12, 15 years have to go through the process again. And we also know how complex and lengthy rural development programs can be, which is why we need to make meaningful investments in capacity building. Folks shouldn't have to hire a professional grant writer when you have a county staff of 3 to access federal programs. We also know that far too often rural communities have been left behind by federal policy initiatives. And just as cooperatives were formed to help small players gain parity through locally led business models, we believe that same investment can be replicated within rural economic development. And supporting residents in local communities by providing for key infrastructure. I mentioned broadband, energy, but also childcare and home care that allows folks to participate in the workforce fully, as well as age in place and see economic opportunity within their rural communities. I also just wanted to highlight supporting both food co-ops and producers through a strong nutrition assistance or nutrition title. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program provides over 41 million low-income individuals with their grocery benefits. And food co-ops serve as a key strategy to address food deserts, which we see occur so often in our rural communities. And as SNAP retailers, they can both support members of the community in providing them with access to food that is often produced locally and sourced locally at a 5 times higher rate than traditional models, but also providing better wage jobs, better quality jobs for rural Americans. But in the spirit of education, again, we have to make sure that the co-op model is recognized within the federal government so that things like a change in board of directors through our democratic governance process doesn't revoke SNAP benefits, which can be devastating for both the co-op and folks who are making that weekly or monthly trip to get their groceries. Bridging the digital divide, as I said, the importance of broadband has been recognized across the board, and rural electrics are well positioned to do so, as they're currently serving over 40 million households with over 200 electric co-ops deploying or developing plans for broadband. And this includes 92% of our persistent poverty counties that makes up 68% of which are rural counties. So how can we better empower rural electric co-ops here? And Reconnect has been an incredible program that offers loans, grants, and loan grant combinations to rural electric cooperatives for broadband deployment. So making that program more accessible to folks and recognizing that cooperative difference seems like it could be a key strategy to moving forward and making sure that everyone has access to a reliable broadband connection. And lastly, on the Farm Bill here, just talking about international cooperative development, as we as an organization work to build resilient communities by supporting co-op development among small farmers, helping to deploy climate smart agriculture practices, and strengthening cooperatives, whether within the financing sector or allowing more women and gender equity and social inclusion in countries across the board. So these are key programs, and I won't go through all of them here, but support for these programs are critically important. I just want to highlight the Cooperative Development Program and the work of OCDC and its member entities in making sure that cooperative development can continue to create more resilient local economies. So shifting out of the Farm Bill, small business through cooperative access to capital is top of mind for NCBA CLUSA and our members. We know that small businesses are, again, the backbone of local economies and Main Street America. And we see the silver tsunami, as we like to call it, that large swath of baby boomers who are going to retire in the next 10 to 15 years, who are disproportionately owners of small businesses to the tune of about 56%. Once these folks retire, what's going to happen to these community institutions and the services that they provide? They are either going to close or maybe be acquired by a larger corporation that isn't rooted in principles like the 7 cooperative principles and reinvest in those local economies. We think, and the co-op community made their voices heard, that converting to a small business or converting that small business to a worker or consumer-owned cooperative is a better option for folks across the board, again, with those higher jobs, with that higher rate of local reinvestment, and ultimately preserving those community institutions. And in 2018, Congress also recognized that with the passage of the Main Street Employee Ownership Act, but we haven't seen that legislation fully materialize to make sure that cooperatives can leverage SBA's programs to finance cooperative conversions. Through our ownership structure of one member having one vote and equal stakes of ownership across the board, co-ops can't access this program. So, we remain focused on making sure that traditional lending institutions within the federal government recognize the cooperative model and that we can access this. And then looking at affordable co-op housing, something that we have as an institution or looked at as a piece of legislation that could address this would be ensuring, again, equitable access for the cooperative model is recognized at the federal level to address the number of people who have access to affordable housing cooperatives through either limited equity or resident-owned communities. And during last year's appropriation cycle, we also saw the recognition of employee ownership expansion through passage of the Worker Ownership and Readiness and Knowledge Act. Some of the statistics I highlighted earlier about the number of small businesses that are set to close and the feasible and proven alternative of cooperatives as a method of preserving these community institutions and small businesses presented a challenge. And the cooperative community made our voices heard loud and clear. So through this initiative, it appropriates $50 million over 5 years to create an employee ownership initiative through the Department of Labor. This includes establishing state offices of employee ownership, and we've seen those offices start to be stood up in places particularly such as Colorado and California and New York, as well as Washington, which most recently passed legislation to support employee ownership. It will also provide grants to these state employee ownership offices to provide education and outreach and really build on the capacity of the work that cooperative development organizations are doing across the board. It will also help fund projects to gather that best data and information about these programs. Data is really key when it comes to advocacy and highlighting the cooperative difference, having those numbers to back it up when you tell your co-op story and share the benefits that your cooperative has to the community. Having those numbers to back it up is really key. So we are excited to engage with the Department of Labor on gathering this information, but we will need everyone's help to make sure that they're getting that outreach from folks who are doing this good work on the ground, such as yourselves. And then they'll create a clearinghouse with best practices within employee ownership. Also just want to mention the passage and implementation of new legislation, such as the CHIPS and Science Act, which passed in 2022. There is a program to create and rebuild our manufacturing industry through the Regional Technologies and Innovation Tech Hub programs. So it'll allow employee-owned development centers and associations to be eligible partners in creating tech and innovation strategies through the designated tech hubs. While the application process closed a few months back, we're going to see who received these awards, which areas, and how cooperatives can continue to be injected into the model. And talking about implementing new legislation, I just want to highlight there are so many great funding opportunities that are out there right now to support our farmers, to support regional and local food processing initiatives, to also support local economic development in specific sectors, as we see with the tech hubs. And the key to that is really making those connections on the ground, whether talking to your city or county governments, your economic development agencies. We know that cooperatives make a distance as a community, and we need to not be as humble as we oftentimes are and brag about all of the things that we're doing to ensure that as these pieces of legislation are either implemented or reauthorized, folks know that we are here, know about the difference that we make in our communities, and know that we can be a key solution to the issues that they are looking to address. So that wraps up my remarks for today. And I will turn it back to you, Lisa.
Thank you so much. I see that our Q&A is empty, so if anyone has a question, feel free to put it in the Q&A. I guess I can just start out. I had a question. You identified a lot of federal legislation and federal programs, and I'm wondering if there are any examples of local legislation or local programs either at the state or the city level that really stand out to you as being sort of exemplars of good co-op policy?
Yes, absolutely. And I appreciate that question. Oftentimes we can see these federal resources that sort of start at the top and then flow down to our state and local governments. And I will just highlight two recent examples, starting with, I guess, the older one, which is through the American Rescue Plan Act. There was about $300 billion that went to every single state, city, and county government within the country. And there are 3,069 counties within the country, so a whole lot of options for folks to tap into. And through this funding source, the federal government recognized that allowing local policymakers to decide how to best support economic recovery for their communities is to directly give them these funding sources. And over the last 2 to 3 years, as this funding will expire in 2030, so we have quite a bit of time, we've seen quite a few city and county governments use funding to support local economic development and local business development and workforce development as we see our workforce age getting a little bit older, or not having as many workers or high quality jobs, or supporting those small businesses that closed during the pandemic. There are a few co-op development organizations who have been able to make that connection, because what do co-ops do? Create better small businesses that are owned by the members of the community and create better quality jobs. So, for example, in Michigan, in Lansing County, they are now partnering with a co-op development organization, shout out to C2BE, to provide business succession planning, because only 20% of business owners have an idea of what's going to happen to their business when they decide to retire. So that's one example. And NCBA CLUSA has been tracking these ARPA investment plans through city and county government. So I would encourage you to continue to check out our resources on our website, where we will update that as opportunities for other folks to tap in. Again, every single city, county, and state government across the country. So there's huge opportunities to inject co-ops as a part of that strategy. At the state level, the employee ownership movement and worker cooperative movement has gotten a ton of energy in the last few years. We know that it is the fastest growing sector, and leveraging that momentum, we've seen Washington pass a new bill to support employee ownership by providing tax credits to convert existing businesses to cooperatives, as well as a loan fund to support cooperative startups. And Colorado just passed a new initiative to support their employee ownership office, and we see new efforts to revive that in New York and Massachusetts as well. So those are just a few highlights, but it's happening definitely across the board.
Thank you. And is there a title, or what's your tracker of state and city legislation? Does that tracker have a title on your website, or how can folks be directed to that?
Yeah, so our Co-op Weekly, we've highlighted a few examples of some of the existing opportunities that are out there, but on the advocacy page of ncbaclusa.coop, you can find a table of those resources that will continue to be updated, and I'd be happy to share that with you for folks after the webinar.
Great, thanks. We do have one question in the Q&A. Someone's asking if there was any discussion, and I don't think there was, about the intersection of co-ops with seasonal workers or H-2A visas. I don't know if you can touch on that at all.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, the H2A program and reform to the H2A program has really been top of mind over the last few years. We've seen some pieces of legislation to support farm workforce, such as, for example, the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, because unfortunately, like many federal programs, there are a lot of complexities for both the users as well as an administrative burden to even tap into it, and to be as flexible as folks need it to be across the board. I would say the Farm Bill is an upcoming opportunity where we may see renewed efforts to address farm workforce shortages. And I know that some cooperative development centers over the years have helped to support this work. I believe Rocky Mountain Farmers Union did help to support a farm workforce cooperative develop or co-op in its development phases through the RCDG program a few years back. But figuring out how we can capitalize on new opportunities that may not be quite as tailored to fit or have the flexibilities built into it, but where can we look for opportunities to improve on it moving forward? And so I would just say that as you know, we keep eyes on what's happening at the federal level, looking again for those opportunities of resources flowing through state and local governments to tap into that to support the workforce needs, but also that just highlights the importance of incredibly flexible funding for capacity building. As we know, every rural community is different, every farm is different, the needs of agricultural co-ops across the board are different. And through our partnership with NFU, we continue to engage on this work.
Thank you. Along those same lines, someone in the chat asked if there are any discussions of worker first right of refusal in the sale of enterprises, or in the sale of co-ops, I suppose.
Yes, as far as the sale of enterprises, you know, I'm not sure that that has made its way up to the federal level. I would say at the local level, and maybe not talking about enterprises specifically, but we have seen where cooperatives, particularly thinking about housing co-ops here in DC where I live, where the co-op movement was key to getting that right of first refusal within DC housing policy, where if the owner of the building wanted to sell that property, they would first have to offer it to the tenants. And Linda Leaks, who was just recognized in the Cooperative Development Foundation's Hall of Fame a few weeks ago, was key to making sure that that was top of mind for policymakers. But that is a great question and flag. And I would say, you know, starting with your local governments, because policy flows also from the bottom up, though resources flow from the top down within our federal policy environment.
Great, thank you. I don't see any more questions, so I can give folks the hour back. I just want to point to the chat. I left a link to a survey about this webinar. It's 4 questions, really short. We would greatly appreciate if the viewers filled out that survey, and also a link to our co-op newsletter. So National Farmers Union has co-op programming throughout the year, and if you want to stay in touch with us, you can subscribe to our newsletter. But I want to thank Aaliyah and National Cooperative Business Association for joining us today. You can keep up with what NCBA CLUSA is doing at their website, ncbaclusa.coop. And have a great day, everyone. Thanks for joining us.